The building was empty except for the hum of the copier and the sound of Sofia Reyes's own breathing. It was 11:40 at night, and she was alone on the 9th floor of Castellano Imports, reading a single sentence for the third time, because the first 2 times she'd assumed she was tired. She wasn't tired. The clause had been changed. Not obviously. Not in a way anyone skimming the English translation would catch. The original Italian read diritti esclusivi di transito per un periodo di 5 anni, exclusive transit rights for a period of 5 years, held by the Castellano company. The English draft in front of her, the one due on Damian Castellano's desk by morning, read non-exclusive transit rights. 1 word. 2 letters technically, the difference between ES and nothing at all. Sofia had translated contracts for 11 years. She knew the difference between a careless error and a deliberate one, the way a locksmith knows the difference between a broken lock and a picked one. This was picked. Someone had gone into the finished translation after she'd submitted her draft and changed exactly 1 word, in exactly the place most likely to be skimmed and least likely to be questioned, in a contract that would hand control of the Castellano family's busiest shipping route to whoever else held transit rights alongside them. She sat very still for a moment, the cursor blinking on an unsent email, and thought about how much money moved through a single port contract, and about how the kind of people who owned shipping companies with names like Castellano did not always settle disagreements about money in courtrooms. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother. "Did you eat dinner, Mija?" And Sofia realized her hands were shaking slightly as she typed back yes, which was a lie, and then looked again at the contract, which was not. She could fix it. Quietly. Change the word back, note it as a typo in her delivery email, and never think about it again. That was the safe thing. That was the thing that kept her freelance contract with the agency, kept the checks coming, kept her mother's apartment paid through the winter. But if someone inside the Castellano organization had made this change on purpose, fixing it quietly wouldn't stop them. It would just mean they'd try again somewhere she wasn't looking. Sofia printed both versions, the original and the altered one, and folded them into her bag before she let herself think too hard about what she was about to do. Down the hall, a light was still on in Damian Castellano's office. She had never spoken to him directly. She had translated for his company for 6 months, always through his assistant, always at a careful distance, because everyone at the agency had the same unspoken rule about the Castellanos. Be useful, be quiet, be gone by 5. She looked at the folded papers in her bag one more time. Then she walked toward the light. Sofia had built her whole career on being the person in the room nobody remembered afterward. It wasn't modesty. It was strategy. A good interpreter disappeared into the language, carried meaning across the gap between 2 people without becoming part of the conversation herself, and that discipline had kept her employed through a decade of difficult clients. Customs brokers who screamed when shipments were delayed, lawyers who blamed her for contracts they hadn't read closely enough, and now, for the last 6 months, the Castellano family, whose shipping business was, on paper, entirely legal, and whose reputation made every employee at the agency lower their voice when they said the name. She'd taken the contract because it paid 3 times her usual rate, and because her mother's rheumatoid arthritis had gotten bad enough that the specialist visits weren't optional anymore, and because freelance work meant there was no sick leave, no safety net. Nothing between Sofia and a missed rent payment except the next invoice she could send. She lived 4 blocks from her mother's apartment, in a studio she'd chosen because it was cheap and because it let her walk to check-in most evenings, and she had exactly 1 rule about men who came with power and money attached. Never let them need you for anything they could hold over you later. She'd learned that rule the hard way from a client 3 years ago who'd offered to take care of things if she'd stop asking questions about a contract that turned out to be laundering freight invoices. And she had walked out of that job with nothing but her integrity and a warning from the agency never to bring it up again. She told herself Damian Castellano was no different. Rich men who ran import companies rarely were. What she knew about him she'd learned secondhand, in the careful way information moved through an office that handled his paperwork, that he'd taken over the company at 26 when his father died, that he ran it with a discipline that bordered on obsession, that he trusted almost no one outside his own blood, and that the one person he trusted without question was his younger brother Marco. Marco Castellano was the version of the family the public saw. He did the charity dinners, the ribbon cuttings for the new warehouse expansion, the interviews where he talked about legacy and community investment in a voice that made reporters forget to ask harder questions. He was warmer than his brother, quicker to smile, the kind of man people trusted on sight, which was, Sofia would later understand, exactly the point. Damian had made a promise to their father on his deathbed, the story went, though nobody outside the family knew the details, that he would never let Marco be pushed to the margins the way their father had once pushed aside his own brother, decades before, in a decision that had cost the family a friendship and nearly cost them the business. Damian had built his loyalty to Marco on the bones of a mistake. He was determined never to repeat. It made him generous with his brother in ways he was generous with no one else. Access to every account, every contract, every negotiation, without the scrutiny he applied to everyone from lawyers to longshoremen. Sofia knew none of the specifics that night. She only knew, from the small print of the contract she'd translated over 6 months, that Marco's initials appeared in places a junior partner shouldn't. On shipping manifests, on vendor approvals, on a customs waiver 2 months earlier that had let a shipment through inspection without the usual paperwork trail. She'd noticed it the way she noticed everything. Quietly, without comment, filed away in the part of her mind that catalogued small inconsistencies because her job depended on catching them. There was a longshoreman at the port, Tommy Alvarez, who she'd talked to twice while confirming manifest terminology for a delivery contract. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s with a laugh that filled a room and a habit of walking new hires through safety procedures like they were his own kids. He'd made her a coffee once, unprompted. The second time she'd come by the docks with questions, and told her she asked better questions than the lawyers did. It was a small thing. It had stayed with her anyway. A reminder that not everyone in this business was a stranger behind a closed office door. That was the world Sofia stood in when she found the altered clause. Careful, watchful, aware that the people around her held more power than she did, and unwilling, despite every rule she'd built for her own protection, to simply look away. Damian Castellano's office door was open a few inches, light spilling into the dark hallway, and Sofia heard voices before she reached it. His, low and even, and Marco's, warmer, closer to a laugh. She knocked before she could talk herself out of it. "Come in," Damian said, without looking up from the papers on his desk. He was younger than she'd expected up close. Mid-30s, dark hair cut close, a jaw that stayed tight even when his voice was calm. Marco sat across from him in one of the leather chairs. Jacket off, tie loosened, a glass of something amber in his hand. He smiled at her the way he smiled at reporters. "You're the interpreter," Marco said before Damian could ask. "Sofia, right? The port contract." "That's right." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Mr. Castellano, I need a few minutes. It's about the contract that's set to go out for signature tomorrow." Damian looked up then. "The transit agreement." "Yes." She set the folded papers on his desk, the original translation, and beside it, the version currently queued for delivery. "There's a discrepancy. One word in the exclusivity clause. My draft says exclusive transit rights. The version in the delivery queue says non-exclusive. I didn't make that change." The room went quiet in a way that had weight to it. Marco set his glass down. "That's not possible. I reviewed the final draft myself before it went to the printer." "I'm not saying it's not possible," Sofia said carefully. "I'm saying it's not what I submitted." Damian pulled the 2 pages toward him, scanning them. His expression unreadable. One word that changes who controls the route for the next 5 years, Sofia said. "If this goes out as it is, you're not signing an exclusive agreement. You're signing away your leverage on that port to whoever else has transit rights on the same terminal." Marco laughed, but there was an edge under it now. "With respect, you're an interpreter. Contract law isn't your specialty, and neither is our business. Typos happen. I'll have it corrected before it's filed." "It's not a typo," Sofia said, holding his eyes for a beat longer than was comfortable. "A typo doesn't move a decimal point to exactly the right place to change a legal right. This was placed." Damian's gaze moved from the pages to his brother, then to Sofia, and something in his face closed like a door. "You're telling me he said, slow and even, "that someone in this office, inside my company, deliberately altered a contract to cost me control of my own port route. I'm telling you I found a discrepancy I can't explain, and I thought you should know before it's signed." "She's speculating," Marco said, standing now. His voice still light but his shoulders set differently than before. "Damian, she's had the file for 6 months. Anyone could have made a keystroke error at the printer at the agency anywhere in the chain. This isn't a conspiracy. It's a mistake." Damian looked at Sofia for a long moment. She watched him decide something. Watched the exhaustion of a man who ran a company built on trust choose, in that instant, the version of events that didn't require him to doubt his own blood. "Fix the clause," he said finally, sliding the pages back across the desk to her, not toward Marco. "Send the corrected version to the agency in the morning. And going forward, if you find something in one of my contracts, you bring it to my office manager, not to me directly, and not at midnight. I came to you directly because... You came to me directly because you wanted credit for catching a mistake that isn't yours to catch," Damian said, and though his voice never rose, the words landed like a slap. "I appreciate the diligence. I don't appreciate being pulled into a confrontation with my brother over a printing error. This conversation is over." Sofia felt the heat rise in her face. Not from embarrassment exactly, but from the specific, familiar sting of being dismissed by someone with the power to make her disappear from his company's roster with one phone call to the agency. "Understood," she said, and gathered the pages. But her hands moved on instinct even as her voice stayed even. As she folded the altered draft to put it back in her bag, she slipped her phone from her pocket and, angled just enough that neither man could see the screen, photographed both versions side by side. She didn't know yet what she'd do with the copy. She only knew, walking out of that office into the dark hallway, past the elevator and down 9 flights of stairs because she didn't trust her hands to stay steady enough to wait for the doors, that she wasn't going to let this go. The call from the agency came 4 days later, at 8:15 in the morning, while Sofia was making coffee in the studio apartment that suddenly felt smaller than it had the week before. "There's been a complaint," her account manager said, not unkindly, but with the particular carefulness people used when they were about to take something away. "Castellano Import says you raised concerns about a contract in an unprofessional manner, went outside the proper channel, and caused a disruption between the client and his business partner. They've requested we not assign you to their account going forward. I found an error in a legal document that would have cost them millions," Sofia said. "I flagged it. That's the job." "I know. Believe you. But they're one of our largest accounts, Sofia, and I don't have the leverage to push back on this. I'm sorry." The call ended with an apology that changed nothing. Sofia sat at her kitchen table for a long time afterward, looking at the folded copies of the contracts still sitting where she'd left them, and thought about the math of her situation with a clarity that felt almost calm. Without the Castellano contracts, she'd lose roughly 40% of her monthly income. Her mother's next specialist appointment was in 3 weeks. Rent was due in 11 days. She could let it go now. Nobody would blame her. She had tried, she had been dismissed, and the sensible thing, the thing that protected her, was to accept the loss and move on to the next client. She thought about Tommy Alvarez instead. It was a name that surfaced 2 days later, when she went back to the port on an unrelated freelance job for a different shipping company and found the loading floor quieter than usual, fewer voices, a stiffness in the air she recognized from workplaces where someone had just been fired. "They suspended him," one of the younger dockworkers told her when she asked, dropping his voice even though there was no one close enough to hear. "Tommy said he signed off on a manifest with the wrong terminal code. Cost them a delay, some kind of paperwork mess with customs. 22 years on the docks and they walk him out like he's a rookie." "When did this happen?" 2 days ago. Same week as some contract thing upstairs, I heard." Nobody's really saying what. Sofia felt something cold settle in her stomach. 2 days after her contract, Tommy, a man who had nothing to do with legal paperwork, whose job was manifests and cargo, not contract language, had been blamed for an error and removed. It was too precise to be coincidence, and too petty, too far beneath a man like Marco's usual polish, unless the point wasn't punishing Tommy at all. The point was making sure nobody upstairs kept looking at manifests, at customs waivers, at the paper trail that ran from the port floor up through the company and into contracts with someone's initials in the wrong place. She found Tommy 2 days later at a diner near the docks, off shift, off the clock, nursing a coffee he clearly couldn't afford to be drinking slowly. "They said I signed the wrong terminal code on a customs form," he told her, staring at the table. 22 years, and I don't remember signing anything that wasn't put in front of me by somebody who told me it was routine. "Who put it in front of you?" Tommy hesitated, the particular hesitation of a man who understood exactly how much power stood between him and his next paycheck. "I don't want trouble, Sofia. I'm not trying to make trouble for you. I think whoever gave you that form is the same person who altered a contract I translated. I think you're being blamed for something you didn't do, the same way I got pulled off this account for catching it." Something in his face shifted. Recognition, maybe, or relief at finally hearing someone say out loud what he'd been too afraid to say himself. "It was one of the office guys. Younger. Said Mr. Marco sent him down with the paperwork. Needed my signature before the shift ended. I didn't think twice. Why would I? Mr. Marco's always been decent to me." Sofia sat back, the pieces settling into a shape she didn't like. That night, at her kitchen table, she pulled every contract she'd translated for Castellano imports over the past 6 months and laid them out like a hand of cards. She found the pattern by 2 in the morning. 3 separate documents, each with a single small alteration, each change routing some sliver of control. A berth allocation here, a demurrage clause there, away from Castellano exclusivity and toward a name she didn't recognize on the counterparty line of 2 of the 3 contracts. R. Volkov Maritime Holdings. She searched the name on her laptop, expecting nothing, and found a 5-year-old news article instead. A federal indictment, racketeering and extortion charges, a mugshot of a heavy-set man with pale eyes named Renzo Volkov, described as a rival import operator who had, according to the article, spent the last 2 decades in a quiet, brutal turf war with the Castellano family over control of the same stretch of port. The article's last line noted Volkov's sentencing: 12 years minimum security, eligible for parole in 8. Sofia did the math on her fingers, feeling the shape of the story change under her hands. 8 years from the sentencing date was 2 years ago. If Volkov had made parole on schedule, he could have been free for as long as this pattern of altered contracts had been running. She thought about walking away from all of it, closing the laptop, deleting the search history, letting Castellano imports and its buried contracts become someone else's problem. It would have been the reasonable choice. But she kept circling back to Tommy's face at that diner table, the particular flatness in his voice when he said 22 years, and I don't remember signing anything that wasn't put in front of me by somebody who told me it was routine. That was the part she couldn't set down. It wasn't abstract anymore. It had a name and a mortgage and 2 kids in community college. And it had happened because someone with more power than either of them had decided a longshoreman's reputation was an acceptable cost for keeping a scheme running 1 more quarter. She thought, too, about her own mother, and the years she'd spent watching her cross a border with nothing and rebuild a life out of sheer refusal to be erased by people who assumed she wouldn't fight back. Sofia had grown up on that example whether she'd meant to or not. Staying quiet had never actually been in her, not really. She'd just gotten very good, over 11 years of freelance work, at mistaking caution for silence, at telling herself that disappearing into the language was the same thing as staying safe. It wasn't. She saw that clearly now, at 2 in the morning, with 3 altered contracts spread across her kitchen table like evidence in a case no one had asked her to build. Disappearing into the work had kept her employed. It hadn't kept anyone safe. Not Tommy, not the longshoreman who might come after him, not even in the end herself. She sat with that thought until the sky outside her window started to lighten, and then she picked up her phone, scrolled to a number she'd saved without any real plan to use it, and typed a message to Damian Castellano's office line that she knew would probably go straight to voicemail, and probably straight into a trash folder after that. This isn't the first altered contract. There's a pattern, and it leads to a name you'll recognize. I think you're in more danger than you know, and I think it's coming from someone closer than you think. She hit send before she could stop herself, and then sat in the gray morning light, waiting to see whether anyone would answer. Damian Castellano did not believe in coincidences, which was the only reason he was still awake at 1 in the morning 3 days later, going through 5 years of shipping contracts by himself in a locked office, because a woman he'd humiliated in front of his brother had sent him a message he couldn't make himself delete. He had told himself the first 2 days that it was paranoia dressed up as diligence, that Sofia Reyes was an interpreter with a grudge over a lost contract, reaching for drama to justify her outrage. But the name in her message had stayed lodged in his mind like a splinter. Volkov. A name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in his own office in 5 years, since the trial, since the day he'd stood in a courtroom and watched the man who'd ordered the arson that killed 2 of his father's oldest employees get sentenced to a term that felt, even then, too short. He pulled the parole records through a contact who owed him a favor and felt something go cold in his chest when the date came back. Renzo Volkov had been released 8 months ago. Months. Almost exactly the window in which 3 contracts. 3. Once Damian went back through the files himself with a discipline he usually reserved for numbers, not language, had been quietly, invisibly altered in ways that benefited a maritime holding company he now recognized, buried under layers of shell registration, as Volkov's. He called Sofia the next morning, and when she didn't pick up, she was, in fact, staring at the unknown number and letting it ring twice before her hands stopped shaking enough to answer. He left a voicemail with none of the coldness of their last conversation in it. "This is Damian Castellano. I'd like to talk. Properly this time." They met at a coffee shop 2 blocks from the agency, Neutral Ground, because Sofia had made it clear on the phone that she wasn't setting foot in his office again without a reason that didn't end with her contract being quietly terminated a second time. "I looked into what you sent me," Damian said, sliding into the seat across from her without any of his brother's practiced warmth, just a directness that felt, oddly, more honest. "Volkov's out. Has been for 8 months. I should have known that before a translator had to tell me. I'm not trying to make you feel foolish. I know. That's almost worse." He turned his coffee cup slowly, not drinking it. "I need you to walk me through what you found. All of it. And I need you to understand that if you're right, this isn't a contract problem anymore. This is dangerous, for you and for me. And I owe you an apology for not taking that seriously the first time you tried to tell me." Sofia laid it out for him. The 3 altered contracts, the pattern Tommy's suspension, the name Volkov buried in the counterparty filings. Damian listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening incrementally with each new piece, until she reached the part she'd been avoiding. "The changes were made after I submitted my drafts, inside your system, by someone with access to the final files before they went to print. That's not an outside hack. That's someone inside your company." "I know," Damian said quietly. "I've been through the access logs myself. 3 people have that level of file permission. My office manager, who's worked for my father since before I was born. My lawyer, who's been with the family longer than I have. And Marco." He said his brother's name like it cost him something physical. "I'm not accusing anyone," Sofia said carefully. "I'm telling you what the pattern shows. You don't have to accuse him. I can do the arithmetic myself." Damian's voice was flat now, controlled in the specific way of a man holding something back by force. "My father made me promise before he died that I'd never let Marco end up on the outside of this family the way his own brother did. Pushed out, cut off, treated like he didn't belong to the blood that built this business. I've spent 15 years keeping that promise. Giving him access. Giving him trust, one question with no one else. And I think," he stopped. "You think that trust is the reason nobody's caught this until now. I think," Damian said, "that I've been so afraid of repeating my father's mistake that I built a blind spot exactly where the 2 of you needed me to build one. If it's him." Sofia watched him sit with that, and felt something shift in how she saw him. Not the cold man from the office 4 days ago, but someone genuinely undone by the shape of what she'd handed him. "I need to be honest with you about something else," she said. "The agency won't reinstate me on your account unless you personally request it. And I'm not asking you to because I don't want to be positioned as someone with something to gain from making accusations against your family. If we do this, I need it to be about the evidence. Not about me proving I was right. Damian looked at her for a long moment. Understood. But I am asking you to help me find out the truth. Not because I doubt what you found. I don't, not anymore. But because I don't trust myself to read this clearly where my brother is concerned. I need someone who reads contracts the way you do. Someone who isn't related to him. And if it is him, then I have to decide whether I keep a promise to my father or keep the company, and the people in it, safe, Damian said. They built the case the way Sofia built every translation. Methodically, cross-checking every claim against something that couldn't be argued with. The plan had 3 parts, and Sofia insisted on all 3 before she'd agreed to move forward. First, the digital timestamp on the original contract file, proof, buried in the file's metadata, of exactly when the exclusivity clause had been altered and, if the system logged it correctly, whose credentials had made the edit. Second, an independent verification. A customs officer named Priya Nair, who had processed the original waiver 2 months earlier and could confirm, from her own agency's records, what the unaltered terms had actually specified before anyone touched the language. Third, and hardest to secure, Tommy Alvarez's willingness to say on record who had brought him the manifest form with Marco's name attached. I won't put him in the room unless he's protected, Sofia told Damian the 3rd time they met, this time in a back office at the agency that her account manager had quietly let her use after hours, out of guilt for the account she'd lost. He's got 2 kids in community college and a mortgage. If this goes sideways and Marco keeps his position, Tommy's the one who pays for it. He'll have a job with this company for as long as he wants one, whatever happens with Marco, Damian said. That's not negotiable. And you? He hesitated in a way that surprised her, this careful, controlled man suddenly searching for words. I'm not going to ask you to be in that room as bait. If Marco realizes what we're doing before we have the proof locked down, I don't know what he'll do, and I won't put that on you. I appreciate that. But I'm the one who can read the language fastest, in real time, if he tries to argue his way around what the document says. You need me in the room. I need you safe more than I need you in the room. That's not your decision to make for me, Sofia said evenly, and watched something flicker across his face. Not offense but recognition. I'll be careful. I'm not reckless. But I found this. I'm not going to hand it off and disappear so the men in the room can finish it without me. Damian was quiet for a moment. You're right. Sorry. Old habit. I run a business where I'm used to deciding things for people who work for me. You don't. It was, Sofia thought, the first time in this entire ordeal that a Castellano had corrected himself without being forced to. The metadata check took 4 days and came back cleaner than either of them expected. Priya Nair, once Damian formally requested customs cooperation through legitimate channels, was able to confirm the original waiver terms within an afternoon, an independent record that couldn't be dismissed as opinion or grudge. The file timestamp was trickier. Castellano's system logged edits by device, not always by individual login, but it placed all 3 alterations as coming from a terminal in the executive suite, after hours, on days that matched, when Damian quietly checked his own calendar against Marco's. No meetings, no reason for anyone but Marco to be in that office. Tommy agreed to speak in the end, not because Damian promised him protection, but because Sofia sat with him at the same diner table a second time and told him, plainly, that staying silent hadn't protected him the first time, and it wouldn't protect the next dockworker Marco needed to blame for something either. There were quieter moments in those days too, the kind Sofia hadn't expected to matter as much as they did. Damian, waiting with her outside Priya Nair's office on a day the meeting ran long, told her without prompting about learning the shipping business from his father as a teenager, hauling crates before he was old enough to read a manifest, and how strange it felt now to be undoing, contract by contract, the trust his father had built the company on. Sofia told him in turn about her mother. Not the illness, not yet, but the woman herself, sharp-tongued and stubborn, who'd crossed a border with nothing and built a life anyway, and how Sofia had learned her own stubbornness from watching her do it. Once, walking back from the customs office in the rain neither of them had planned for, Damian offered her his jacket, and when she refused it on principle, he didn't argue, just walked half a step closer so the umbrella he did have covered them both, and let the moment be exactly what it was. Small, ordinary, unhurried by anything except two people getting soaked together and neither of them minding. The boundary came 2 days before the meeting, when Damian suggested, almost offhand, that it might be safer if Sofia stayed home from the final signing and let him present the findings alone. No, Sofia said without heat, but without room for negotiation either. I told you. I'm not disappearing at the last step. If you want my help closing this, it comes with me actually being there when it closes. Damian studied her for a long moment, and something that looked almost like respect settled into his expression. Then you're there, he said. And I'll make sure the room is secure enough that being there doesn't cost you anything it shouldn't. By the night before the signing, the contract renewal meeting Marco himself had scheduled weeks earlier, unaware it would become something else entirely, everything was in place. The metadata records, pre-and written verification, Tommy's. The conference room on the 9th floor smelled like fresh coffee and printer toner. And Marco Castellano walked in 5 minutes late, jacket open, smiling the smile that had gotten him out of harder rooms than this one. Sorry, the Volkov Maritime people are running late too apparently, he said, dropping into his usual chair. Should give us a minute to go over the final terms before. He stopped. Sofia was already seated at the table, a folder open in front of her. Beside it sat Damian, unreadable, and beside him, the family's longtime lawyer, and near the door, quiet and steady in a suit that didn't fit him quite right, Tommy Alvarez. What's this? Marco said, and Sofia noted, with the part of her mind that had spent a career listening for exactly this, that it wasn't a question. It was a man recalculating. We're not signing the renewal today, Damian said. We're going through the last 3 contracts first. Starting with this one. He nodded to Sofia. She didn't rush. She'd learned, over 11 years, that the fastest way to lose a room was to sound like you were racing to convince it of something. 6 weeks ago, I translated a transit rights renewal for this company, she said, sliding the original draft across the table, then the altered version beside it. My submitted version specifies exclusive transit rights for 5 years. The version that went into the delivery queue that same night specifies non-exclusive rights. Language that, once signed, would have opened Castellano's primary berth to a competing operator for the length of the agreement. She let that sit. I didn't make that change. The system logs confirm the edit was made after my submission, from a terminal in this office, after hours, on a night your calendar shows no meetings scheduled but yours, Marco. That's absurd, Marco said, laughing, but it came out thin. Anyone could access that terminal. Half the executive floor has. Half the executive floor doesn't have a personal relationship with the counterparty quietly buried behind the shell company on 2 of the 3 altered contracts, Sofia said, and placed the second folder on the table. The customs record, pre-and sign verification, the corporate filing that traced our Volkov Maritime Holdings back through 3 shell layers to a name everyone in the room recognized. Renzo Volkov was released from federal custody 8 months ago. Every altered clause we've found benefits his company. Every alteration originates from your access. Marco's smile was gone now, replaced by something colder, more calculating. The version of him Sofia guessed few people outside this room had ever seen. You're building a case out of coincidence and a translator's grudge, Damian. This woman lost her contract with us. Of course she'd. I put her back on this account personally before this meeting, Damian said quietly. I've seen the logs myself, Marco. I've seen the calendar. I don't need her to make a case. I built it beside her, because I couldn't believe it without seeing it myself. For the first time, Marco looked briefly like a man out of moves. Then he found one more. Even if some of this is true, even if I made changes to protect this family's actual interests, because you've gotten soft, Damian, because you've spent 15 years playing it safe while I watched Dad's real legacy get whittled down to shipping contracts and charity dinners, you don't have proof I coordinated with Volkov. You have a translator's theory and an old man's suspended shift. I have more than a theory, Tommy said, and it was the first time he'd spoken since walking in. His voice shook slightly, but he didn't stop. 2 weeks before I got suspended, a kid from upstairs brought me a manifest form, told me it was routine, said you sent him. I signed it because I trusted you, Mr. Marco. Same as I trusted you for 22 years on those docks. That form's the one that got me blamed for the customs delay that just happened to line up with when your outside friend's shipment needed to clear without the usual checks. He's confused. An old man, embarrassed about losing his job. He's not confused, Damian said, and his voice had changed now, something final settling into it. I checked the security footage from that shift myself 2 days ago. The kid who brought Tommy that form works in your office. Direct hire. Reports to no one but you. The room went silent in the specific way rooms go silent when an argument has run out of places to hide. Sofia watched Marco's face over the next several seconds, watched the polish crack, watched him look for an exit and not find one, watched, finally, something almost like relief settle underneath the anger, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 3 years managing a lie and had, perhaps, wanted it to end for longer than he would ever admit. You want to know why, Marco said finally, quietly, to his brother, and it wasn't a defense anymore. Dad built this company and left it to you. Not to both of us. To you. I got the smile, the dinners, the ribbon cuttings, the part where I get to look like family without ever actually holding any of it. Volkov offered me a real stake. Real ownership. Something with my name on it that wasn't a courtesy title you gave me because you felt guilty. I gave you access to everything I have, Damian said, and for the first time since Sofia had met him. His voice cracked slightly at the edges. Every account. Every contract. I kept a promise to Dad that cost me every ounce of scrutiny I gave anyone else in this company, because I was terrified of becoming the version of him that pushed his own brother out. And you used that promise to sell us to the man who burned 2 of Dad's oldest employees alive. Marco didn't answer that. Sofia let the silence hold for a moment, and then she spoke, because someone needed to say the thing that mattered more than the accusation. This isn't just about what happens to Marco, she said, looking at Damian. It's about what happens to Tommy, who lost 22 years of trust in one afternoon because it was convenient. It's about whoever's next, the next person blamed for a mistake that isn't theirs, if the pattern that let this happen doesn't change. Justice here isn't just consequences for him. It's making sure this company doesn't run on blind trust in one direction and none in another, ever again. Damian looked at her for a long moment, something settling behind his eyes. Not just agreement, but a kind of relief at finally being told out loud, by someone with nothing to gain from flattering him, exactly what needed to happen next. Marco, he said, turning back to his brother, you're removed from every position in this company effective today. The Volkov contracts are void. My lawyer will make sure of that by end of week. What happens beyond this room, whether Volkov's people come after you for the deal falling through, isn't something I can protect you from anymore. That protection ended the day you decided my trust was something to spend instead of something to keep. And Tommy, Sofia added, gets reinstated with full back pay and a written correction to his record, effective immediately. Damian nodded, not needing to be asked twice. Done. Marco stood, straightened his jacket with hands that weren't quite steady, and looked at his brother one last time. Not with the polish of the man who'd walked in, but with something rawer, closer to grief. You'll regret this, he said, though it came out more like a question than a threat. Maybe, Damian said. But I'd regret the other thing more. Marco left without another word. Tommy exhaled like he'd been holding his breath for 2 weeks. And Sofia sat back in her chair, the folder closed in front of her, feeling the particular quiet exhaustion of a fight that was, finally, actually over. 6 weeks later, the port looked exactly the same. The same cranes, the same gulls circling over the containers, the same low horn of a freighter easing into berth, but almost everything underneath it had changed. Marco Castellano was gone from the company entirely. His name removed from every filing. The territory his shell dealings had briefly endangered secured back into full Castellano control through a settlement Damian's lawyer negotiated with the Port Authority as restitution for the near breach. Where Marco had gone after that final meeting, Damian didn't say, and Sofia didn't ask. Some doors, once closed, were better left that way. Tommy Alvarez was back on the docks, back pay deposited. His record formally corrected with a letter from Damian himself acknowledging the company's failure to protect him. He still made Sofia coffee when she came by. though now he made a point of telling every new hire on his crew, only half joking, that if something felt wrong on paper, they should say so loudly and to whoever would actually listen. The agency reinstated Sofia's contract with a formal apology on record and, at Damian's quiet insistence, a policy change that meant no interpreter's warning about a contract discrepancy could be dismissed without a documented review. A small, systemic thing, easy to overlook, that meant the next Sofia, whoever she turned out to be, wouldn't have to fight this hard just to be heard. Damian changed how his own company verified contracts too. 2 independent sets of eyes on every final draft before filing, time-stamped, logged, no exceptions for family. It was a small bureaucratic fix for a wound that ran much deeper. The particular grief of a man who had spent 15 years protecting a promise to his father, only to learn that the promise itself had been the blind spot all along. But Sofia watched him build it anyway, brick by careful brick, the same way she'd watched him build the case against his own brother, because he'd rather do the hard, correct thing than the comfortable one. She found him on the observation deck above the loading floor one evening in late autumn, watching the last shift of the day work the cranes in the fading light, and stood beside him without either of them saying much for a while. "I keep thinking about what you said," Damian said eventually. "That this wasn't just about Marco. About the pattern that let it happen in the first place. And I think I spent 15 years so afraid of becoming my father's version of loyalty, the kind that leaves someone out in the cold, that I built the opposite mistake instead. Trust with no floor under it at all." He looked at her. "You didn't have to keep pushing after I threw you out of my office that first night. I gave you every reason to walk away." "I thought about it," Sofia admitted. "More than once. But walking away doesn't actually protect you if you're the kind of person who notices things. It just means you carry what you noticed alone." Damian was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, I'd like to keep working with you. Not because of what happened. Because you're the best interpreter I've ever hired. And I trust your read on a room more than I trust most people's." "I'd like that," Sofia said, and meant it, though she was careful still, the way she'd always been careful, not to let the warmth in his voice become something she leaned on before it had earned the weight. There was no promise between them yet. No grand gesture. Nothing tied up the way the ending of a story about a mafia boss was supposed to look. Just 2 people who had built something honest out of a mistake neither of them had made alone, standing on a dock in the last light of the day, willing, for the first time, to see what came next without either of them rushing to name it. Somewhere below them, a container settled into place with a heavy metal sound, and the crane operator's radio crackled with the ordinary chatter of a shift almost done. The sound, Sofia thought, of a system finally working the way it was supposed to, one honest signature at a time. There's a version of this story where loyalty means never asking questions, and a version where it means asking the hardest ones, even when the person you love most doesn't want to hear them. Damian Castellano spent 15 years believing the first version was the whole of what he owed his family. It nearly cost him everything he was trying to protect. So here's the question worth sitting with. If someone you trusted completely handed you a promise built on silence,